Thanks everyone for coming along today. This is a bit of a new project for us in terms of the way the Emerging Talent Program works within Snow Australia. It's something that we put quite a bit of time into over the last probably 6 to 8 months, really around when when COVID hit. We had a lot of time to review a lot of our programs and the way the systems run, and especially around emerging talent. First and foremost, how we actually nominate and select the athletes for the Emerging Talent Program, who's involved in that, and we really wanted to understand probably the mechanisms that go around selecting athletes the right way. One of the things that came out of the review of it was probably the lack of transparency with the way the Emerging Talent Program worked within all the clubs and all the performance pathway programs, and that's something that we really identified as a key part of moving forward into a different space of being more inclusive than exclusive with the way we operate the program. So we undertook a review, and that review then led us into really understanding what it is to identify talent within the pathway, and that was a whole of sport approach that was speaking with the institute programs, OWIA, NSWIS, current performance pathway programs, coaches, parents, experts within the system. And we really looked at how we're going to identify talent moving forward. And then out of the back of that, we then looked at probably the nomination process, about how we select athletes onto the program. And one of the things that we wanted to really make sure of this time round is that the club coaches within all the resorts and coaches through the performance pathway programs, they actually had a vested interest in nominating athletes for the program. And that was really crucial for the process, because they're the coaches that actually see those athletes day to day. Secondary to that, we have been quite fortunate with some performance pathway funding and also some solutions grants, and that's come about through co-funding through Snow Australia, AIS, Sport Australia, and then some funding through some other commercial sponsors like the LIN Partners, has enabled us to really expand the offering for the Emerging Talent Program, and really expand the workforce that's behind actually looking after, nominating and selecting athletes. And that's been a big part of the process as well. One of those appointments, which has been crucial to the program moving forward, has been Ben Bond. Ben comes on board with us in a role which is really around managing or case managing the Emerging Talent Program and athletes that sit within it. Ben is a physio within our physio network, and he comes to us with a wealth of experience. And his title really kind of encaptures his role, which is the Talent, Health and Performance Coordinator. And Ben's going to be working closely with myself and Rebecca Clark in the Pathway Coordinator role to really look at the talent, look at where that talent is coming from, and then really case managing that talent to hopefully guide athletes into the institute programs such as NSWIS, OWIA, and really make sure that those gaps and some of those performance measures are looked after in a more individual basis. So I want to introduce Ben. Ben's going to run most of this session today. He's actually overseas at the moment. He's in Austria or Switzerland with one of our programs, but has been instrumental in helping pull together the nomination process and some of the key aspects of the program that we're going to look at to how we nominate and select and case manage the athletes within the Emerging Talent Program. So a warm welcome to Ben, and I'll let him take it away.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that introduction, Ben. It was a great summary of what we've been working on more recently, and then where you guys have come from a more of a organisational point of view with Snow Australia and the ETP scheme over the last 8 to 9 months. So I do apologise if you can see me down the bottom of your screen. It is quite dark where I am, so not a whole lot of natural light, but hopefully you can see me a little bit. As Ben touched on, the content of today will be essentially a summary of where the ETP program is at, how we envisage that will run over the calendar year. We will go through some background information on how we actually identify this talent and then break that down a little bit further in terms of how we go about the athlete profiling, and within Snow Australia we have come up with some profiling pillars of development which we think are integral to the developing athlete moving forward. We will talk a little bit about my role and how I can assist in the athlete case management of certain targeted athletes moving forward within the ETP program, and then how we envisage things will unfold and a few projected outcomes moving forward down the track of how we hope things will unfold on this front. So as Ben highlighted, I'm a physio, have been for the past 8 years. I've worked predominantly within private practice and elite sport, mostly snow sport and AFL football. I've got a keen interest in the developing athlete, which certainly ties in nicely with this role, and have some experience on the winter side of things from a developing athlete point of view with the Winter Youth Olympic Games last year, which we were very lucky to get off and run, with the world being pretty normal at that point in time, and then have had some involvement with the OWIA Sports Medicine Network for the past 4 or so years. Just a bit of housekeeping, I suppose, on the nomination timeline of where we are at with ETP. So application process is open at the moment, and there's potentially a lot of you that have had a look at your discipline-specific nomination forms and processes. So that is open at the moment. If you haven't had a chance to look at that and you are in the position to nominate athletes moving forward, then I strongly encourage you to do so. Bet Clark has put a huge amount of work into that in conjunction with some support from other discipline-specific coaches and committee members. But Beck, a huge amount of effort there, so certainly do appreciate that. Once those applications are in, they'll go through a review process, and that's with members of the National Discipline Committee, myself, Ben and Beck, to kind of triage those applications and deem who we think may be appropriate for different stages of the program. And then we envisage by early May that the athlete and coaches will be notified through a letter of offer, and then we will outline the program distribution for the calendar year of how ETP will run. So summarising on the ETP front, there is, and this is in response to a couple of questions and that we've had in the lead up to this webinar, there is no age bracket for the ETP nominations, and we more base that around the F10 framework of encapsulating that athlete pathway, and we'll touch on that a little bit more shortly. We encourage the coaches to use as much supporting data as you have access to, and there'll be a little bit of discussion about how you may go about capturing more data prior to your application or nomination if you want to. We encourage you to be as honest as you can in the nomination process, and this just certainly streamlines our role on the other end when we are reviewing these, that we have an as accurate nomination as possible that we are assessing. And then we'll talk a little bit about athlete profiling moving forward, and we ask you that you try and almost perform your own profiling as a coach prior to nominating these athletes, and that'll just promote some reflection on not only the vision that we've got with things moving forward, but also some reflection on where your athletes are at within your own coaching program. And there will be the occasional athlete without a coach that will be considered for nomination on a case-by-case basis, and that will be by the National Discipline Committees. That will be by Ben, myself and Beck, but we envisage that will be a very small amount of athletes. So just in summary, before we delve too deeply, the Emerging Talent Program itself is a talent identification and development program which aims to identify, support, and enhance preparation of potential performance athletes for transition into the performance pathway programs. And we think that that last point is really integral. Prior to nomination, the coaches putting these athletes forward actually think that they have good potential to transfer further into the program, and not deeming ETP as just a short-term endpoint in this athlete's career, but more as a launching block for where this athlete will potentially end up down the track. So here we have a bit of a summary of the F10 framework and that whole athlete pathway from participation level right through to elite level and mastery level, and essentially summarizing each end of the spectrum, where we have people or snow sport athletes just learning and acquiring basic movement patterns down at F1, and that's just enjoying snow sport for fun and more leisure. And then at the other end of the spectrum we have mastery, which is M1, and probably within our national disciplines we've got a few athletes at that level, Scotty James probably being the most notable one. And then within that we have the whole developing pathway process, and where we see ETP kind of falling within is that T1 to T3 level. And then if we look a little bit closer about where our targeted athletes are, where we get a little bit more of an idea as to where these athletes are potentially going to progress, and those with some potential to really push forward, that's within T2 to T3, and my role in particular will be dealing really closely with these athletes across disciplines within that T2 to T3 range, and seeing how we can facilitate their progression moving forward. But ETP as a whole, depending on the discipline, it can fall within that T1 to T3, and I certainly encourage anyone that hasn't familiarised themselves with the F10 to do so on the Snow Australia website. It's under the Pathways tab, and each discipline actually has a specific breakdown of the F10, each individual tiering and where we expect these athletes to be at different stages of that. So there's been a huge amount of work being put into the F10. It's a really fantastic resource, and we certainly encourage you guys to review that a little further moving forward. And then if we move into talent identification, across sports and across the world, it is traditionally done quite poorly, and that's because it's really difficult to identify future success, and the factors that lead to that are so multifactorial and tough to pick up on from a very early age, and there's no approach which is totally complete to identifying talent. And if it was, I probably wouldn't be in my role, and we'd be able to identify a lot of people very early on who are going to be successful. And these are just a few examples of the approaches that can be undertaken and that are. So the first approach, the talent discovery approach, is essentially highlighting that a winning mindset and talent is innate, and that you have no potential to develop that. You've either got it or you don't. And we select athletes based on that, and that has a really poor prognosis in terms of outcome for success with athletes. So we don't really delve into that as a whole sport approach, but there are certain athletes that do have exceptional talent that will fall into that. The talent development approach, which I'll talk a little bit more about today, is we're developing successful athletes through workshops, structured programs, and individual support. And that is the crux of the work that Ben and everyone has done within the organisation over the past 6 to 8 months, and what we'll really focus on today, but certainly not undermining what the next approach is, and that holistic ecological approach, which essentially is about developing a key environment and culture within the disciplines that promote success. And we really do push and drive this as an organisation as a fundamental baseline layer to all your clubs, but what we will talk about today is more around the talent development approach. And then that leads us to our athlete performance profile, which I'll touch on moving forward. So performance profiling, it may be very familiar to a lot of you, or it may be something which is quite foreign. So I'll summarise it, and then I'll talk about our 5 pillars at Snow Australia and how that can relate to athlete development. So athlete performance profiling, it's a systematic method to enhance and objectify the qualities necessary to achieve optimum performance in a chosen sport. A little bit jargonistic, but essentially it's a very collaborative approach between the athlete and the coach. The views on different areas of the athlete's development are kind of combined together, and then we come up with an actionable plan to enhance the overall performance of the athlete. And as I said, Snow Australia has identified 5 pillars integral to the development of these progressing athletes, and we'll go through those now. So the 5 pillars that we are looking to encapsulate and focus on with the development of emerging talent is mainly around physical, mental, technical, performance, and snow skills. And a lot of these do overlap, and we do note that not one is mutually exclusive to the other, and we will be going through today about how they do overlap with each other and how we can all work together on facilitating improvement within these. So I guess performance profiling overall, the benefits of it, or the anticipated benefits, if it's conducted appropriately, it does assist the athlete and support staff in reflecting of areas of strength and weakness. It addresses potential barriers to the coach, athlete, and parent relationship. It ends up with some common goal setting between athlete, coach, and support staff. And I guess the most important thing is with these younger athletes moving forward is it does enhance the athlete's motivation, their engagement and responsibility in their own development. And we do acknowledge that a lot of these athletes are very young, but the earlier that they can start to acknowledge strengths and weaknesses and where they would like to improve, then that will have a flow-on effect down the track. And I guess for a lot of parents and coaches thinking about where these athletes are within the pathway, it does give a holistic snapshot of where they are at and enhances our ability to kind of track them through the pathway, which we'll talk about a little bit further. Key points for athlete profiling to be successful. We need the information to be delivered in a very easily digestible format that will actually motivate the athlete. And as I've talked about, a lot of these athletes early on in their careers and within the performance pathway will respond very differently to feedback than an established podium level athlete. And we need to acknowledge that as coaches and support staff moving forward, that we tailor the education to these athletes in a way which will motivate them and encourage them to buy in and be engaged and not overwhelm the athlete. A bit of the testing data that we will talk about needs to be very objective where possible, and the athlete and coach need a trusting relationship and a common understanding of how improving in certain areas will lead to an increase or an enhancement of performance. And one of my favorite quotes, not just within sport, but probably physiotherapy as a whole, but I think particularly important with coach-athlete relationship is no one really cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think if you can put it across to your athlete and develop that relationship with them first, and so many of you would be aware of this, then any advice or education that you give them will be so much more powerful than if you're just hounding the athlete with all their negative attributes and where they need to improve. Is not going to be beneficial to that athlete's development. And that can be one of the downfalls of profiling if it is taken the wrong way by the coaches. So developing that relationship first and then feeding through that profiling information in the correct manner will lead to hopefully the best result on that front. So I'm going to go through these 5 pillars briefly back on this snowflake, which we thank Dave Parr for coming up with this concept of the snowflake. I think it works really well. And we'll go through each pillar and where we think that lies within the athlete development process. So the first one we'll touch on is physical capability. And it really gives a reflection of the pure athletic ability and the movement quality of that developing athlete. One of the things I'm really passionate about from a sports physio background is that being strong has a very strong link with injury risk reduction and a moderate link with performance. So essentially, the more physically robust an athlete can be and a young athlete can be, there is a strong link with reducing their chance of getting injured, and there is a moderate link with that in isolation of them becoming a better snow sport athlete. And I guess the big thing is, the stronger or more physically robust a junior athlete is, the more availability they have to train because they're not injured, and the more training they can do over time, the better performance they can actually put out. Now, there are some testing protocols that we look at for developing or gaining a snapshot of where these athletes are at in terms of their strength and physical capability. And if those protocols are done in variable ways, they can actually spit out some really unreliable results. So it may be the case that some coaches will be involved in strength testing these athletes, and we just encourage that they maintain strict protocols with what I'll talk about on the next slide. So some of the risks of variable protocols here: if there's a very stringent protocol in the second testing, they can actually have worse scores in their second test. So they were tested pre-domestic season and post-domestic season. And if they were tested really stringently the second time around, they might actually have worse scores despite having some strength gains within that period, and they may lose motivation. On the contrary, if they have a more relaxed protocol in the second testing and they get tested on the exact same strength test, they may actually have an inflation of their scores, and then the athlete may become complacent, thinking they've done all this great work and become really strong, and then lead to not being as involved within the strength program. So nailing those protocols is really, really important, and you'll probably hear me harp on that a little bit down the track, but something I'm really passionate about, gaining some reliable data with these young athletes. Snow Australia does have some standardised physical capability guidelines, which you can access on the Snow Australia website. I'm more than happy to shoot out the link to everyone at the conclusion of this webinar that has some baseline physical capability measures that we anticipate developing athletes at different stages being able to hit, and that's where these protocols and objectivity is really important. And just highlighted there with those red circles are a couple of things which can be varied within the protocol, which can drastically increase or decrease the result. So, and that's in an example of single leg squats, and we've seen that quite often. So if there is the chance ever to be involved in testing these junior athletes, it's integral that we nail these protocols to get some reliable data. And then how do we track this data? So this is just an example for a select group of these ETP athletes. We will be targeting them and case managing them quite closely, and we will be keeping some data like this within their athlete profile. On the left, we have the athlete introductory movement score, which gives us a breakdown of essentially how efficient these athletes move as they develop through, and we find that changes rather drastically as they are developing and growing. And then we have a summary of these physical capability tasks on the right at different stages and different locations throughout their development. Another metric that I like to look at, and this can be done rather easily, and Hamish Cox from Team Buller, I was talking to him the other day, and Hamish, this is a snapshot of some of the data that Hamish does keep for his athletes, and we thank him for allowing us to use that today. But essentially tracking how many sessions of each modality of exercise are completed throughout a month can be really easily digested and tracked to get some trends with how the athletes are feeling and whether any injuries develop over time, and have they done a lot more of one thing in 1 month, which has led to them being particularly run down or prone to injury, or have they done nothing for 4 months and then had 1 month where they've got back into training and shot up their load, and that's exposed them to being more at risk of injury. So that's something that I like to keep track of in the background. Obviously, with my history and background being in physio, I think that this, particularly with junior athletes, can be done poorly because they're not involved in an institute program and they don't have stringent or constant medical surveillance in terms of their injuries, and often see a lot of different medical providers to manage injuries. And typically when we're younger, we just don't manage injuries as well as what we do than when we take our sport a little bit more professionally. So essentially, past injuries managed poorly have a large impact on future success. And one of the key points that Ben had made to me as I came into this role was that we were hoping to encourage and develop these junior athletes to reduce their injury profiles and make them a little bit more physically robust as they transition into those institute programs, so they can essentially hit the ground running once they do become involved in those programs. And from an NSWIS or an OWIA level, these athletes and medical teams not having to backtrack and build these athletes up again, we envisage and we hope in time that we'll be able to have these athletes coming through with less of an injury profile, because we're just getting some closer surveillance on them during those key years. One of the other pillars is the mental profile, and this is all a little bit subjective, and we certainly don't select or deselect athletes based on their mental profile alone. It is simply a piece to the puzzle of that overall athlete snowflake, so to speak. There are a couple of questionnaires which we may look to taking these junior athletes through, just to give an idea of where they are at in certain mental metrics, and essentially just to confirm what we see on the snow, what we see in the gym, and these personal characteristics of these athletes. It can be just a nice way to align that, and then working on more of those intangibles with the coaches yourselves about how receptive to feedback these developing athletes are, their motivation and commitment, resilience and attitude, effect on team culture, and those sorts of things are really important metrics that do just complete that whole athlete profile. I thank Hamish Cox again for this, which I've drafted into the Moguls performance profile, but looking at our technical or skills profile, obviously being a skill-based sport for a lot of the disciplines, it's very important to track and monitor these over time, and Hamish looks at a series of on-snow and off-snow metrics here, and how that complements the athlete profile also. This is a slide here which I think is really worth spending a little bit of time on, and again just makes us support staff in the background, and I think really important for coaches even at a very club coach level to have some reflection on something like this with where they see their developing athletes. And I guess the bottom left, if we look there, that's a low potential athlete who's an underperformer. So someone who might just really love snow sport, is quite passionate, does it for fun, but has limited potential either from a physical or a mental or a skills point of view to actually progress further into the pathway, and subsequently they're not performing that well. And then if we look up, the top right, we have an obvious talent with above average performance. So there's a few juniors right now that are doing particularly well on the international scene, and they would be ones that have a real obvious talent, and they're performing, at their potential, or they're tracking as per the pathway. And then if we look at where ETP falls, it's probably a lot of grey, and in the middle somewhere around that 4 to 5 to 6, and then it's up to us to determine and work with these athletes about how we can develop them moving forward, and ideally the ones where we probably deem there being less chance of future success are those which may display some early performance metrics which are encouraging, but we deem them as having, you know, less potential to progress through the pathway. That might be because they've developed, you know, physically really early and start to become overtaken by other athletes which are developing, or whether they, you know, have some of those intangible qualities which don't necessarily bode in their favour in terms of receptiveness to feedback, etc. Or we think that they have just capped out their snow skills and they were very successful early on because they were strong, but their snow skills are just not fantastic. And then I guess where we all lick our lips is when we have someone come along who's got very high potential. And I talk about these athletes as having a big upside to them, where we think, gee, they really could be something special, but they're currently underperforming and just need some targeted focus in a few areas to really kick them along to what becomes an 8 and then hopefully a 9 down the track. And I do acknowledge that most of these athletes we are working with are probably somewhere in the middle, but it just gives you an idea about where your athletes may be at and a chance for everyone to be reflective in regards to that, and probably with putting nominations forward as well, just having a think about where your athlete may be within this table and where you potentially see them going. And then, as I talked about earlier, these profiling pillars, they're not mutually exclusive. So improvement or regression in one area can have a large resultant effect in the neighbouring areas. And I guess one of the challenges for my role and coaches as a whole will be, where do we tailor our resources for these developing athletes we think have got some potential to ensure that we get the most bang for buck, so to speak? And we acknowledge that there's a fundamental structure across each program or each coaching program or discipline, but where can we actually add some value areas with these athletes from our profiling results? So using that information intelligently to lead to further progression. And it can be a little bit of a domino effect. So I do want to go through a couple of cases now that are very broad and sort of basic cases, but just give you an idea of how we will interpret this information moving forward. So if we talk about case number 1, so we have a very naturally skilled developing athlete on the snow, and this could be in any discipline. And if we look at what their profile makeup might look like to start off with, they may have very poor physical capability. And this may be our target pillar that we focus on with them. Their mental side of things may be a little limited as well. So we might find that with this athlete that they're not overly confident or they're not resilient in different situations. But they're very talented on the snow, and they've got above average snow skills performance, their acrobatic performance, their body awareness is fantastic. And again, this could be for any discipline, so I'm not being specific or pigeonholing an athlete into any discipline here. But the outcome, based on this limited confidence and based on being really quite weak and physically immature, actually leads to a below average performance for that athlete's potential. But we see them as having a big upside with these other targeting pillars. So then if we work at, over time, building them up and becoming more physically robust, we then see an increase in confidence and they become more resilient psychologically, and then we try and capitalise on that above average snow sport performance and their body awareness, and then they start to improve with their overall results and where we deem them being at in terms of their development. And then we continue to work further on that, and we really target through that left column there about building them up from a physical point of view, and they start to achieve some of the metrics that we envisage them needing to be successful within their sport. They get increased psychological resilience and confidence due to being more physically robust, and they continue to improve on the snow. And then they end up meeting performance standards for progression within the pathway. And that's how we see ETP working ideally, is that we can come in early, we develop a profile of these developing athletes, we work out where we can potentially put our resources to developing them moving forward, and hopefully, all going well, and this won't be the case for everyone, but we give that athlete a chance of progressing further within the pathway, whether that's to NSWIS or OWIA, depending on the discipline. So that's an example of a very naturally skilled developing athlete who is less physically robust. And the next example that I'll give is more of an opposite of that. So that's a very physically capable developing athlete who comes in very strong and robust. They're okay on the mental front, but still got some room for improvement, and obviously being quite young as well. But their on-snow skills are below average, and their body awareness is poor, and therefore they're not performing as good as what we envisaged they could. And this might be in a sport which if we can spend some more on snow time with any sport, but particularly really targeting that area, can lead to a big increase in performance. As we did with our previous athlete, we capitalise on the strength and that physical capability, but the target pillar here is on snow and developing body awareness and their acrobatic performance, their on snow skills. And with an increase in that, we see an increase in confidence and resilience, and their performance increases as well. With a real target to their snow skills and their technical pillar, that improves in time, and they further capitalise on those strengths, those physical capabilities, and then they're at a point ideally where they can progress further through the pathway. So I guess that's where our profiling comes into play and can be really used of benefit if we can actually identify those strengths and weaknesses, get the athlete on board early, and work on increasing that area and having that as a target pillar. And I guess overall, we're looking at limiting barriers for progression within the pathway. And I really encourage everyone to be reflective on, what are barriers for athlete progressions within their pathway. And I've got examples here of what are common barriers. So it might be athlete motivation, thinking about how we can tap into that and further engage our athletes. Is it on snow time that an athlete needs? Are they not getting enough on snow time and therefore they're not progressing? Do they have limited cross-training opportunities? Are they unable to go overseas because we're in the middle of a pandemic and they're losing motivation and they're not getting opportunities to train, and we lose them in the sport because of that? So how can we be creative on this front? Other sports hijacking athletes, and this does happen all the time, and particularly when athletes are young and they're trialling lots of different things. And we certainly don't encourage that athletes specialise too early. But how can we make snow sport in Australia, which is present 3 months of the year, as appealing as a Australian-based sport, which might be around 6 to 9 months of the year? So creating with cross-training opportunities and program structures as to how we can actually engage these athletes for longer periods of time if they're not investing a lot of time abroad in a northern winter. Parents, from time to time, there can always be some tricky ones, and that's just the nature of sport and developing athletes. But how do we use these parents who might be potentially a little bit difficult to manage? How do we use that as a strength to lead to these junior athletes developing further? What's our relationship like with the athlete, not just from a coach perspective, but support staff perspective? And are there some ways which we can focus on developing that? Are there any extra resources that could be needed for these athletes? And that's where my role can come into things, and being in touch with Ben and Beck, and what else can we offer from an ETP point of view which might facilitate development of these athletes. Training continuity, injury, as I've touched on, and I'm quite passionate about this one, obviously. Poor physical condition, does that lead to poor results, and then the athlete end up just leaving the sport? And overall, how engaged our athlete is within their sport. So there's lots of ways which we can focus on that, but that's not my area of expertise, and a lot of your coaches will have some specific strategies around how you do engage your athletes, which I'm sure you're fantastic at. And then team culture as well. So that's the big one. We want athletes we want them to want to be involved in snow sport. We want them to attend training. We want them to be around their teammates, and we want everyone to encourage each other to be better. And this is a fundamental pillar of developing and being successful moving forward. So essentially summarising where these athletes are at along their pathway, we do gather all the information from the profiling pillars, as I've discussed earlier, and we put this into a summary tracking report to give us, you coaches and parents, an idea, and the athletes themselves of where they're at in relation to these 5 developmental pillars, whether they are underperforming, they're on track, they're progressing, and we can leave specific comments and probably in conjunction with the views and feedback from the coaches as well, I think is really important moving forward, and makes this whole process a little bit more transparent as to where these athletes are at. And then from that, I suppose we can, and there is a little bit of grey in here as well, but from our identified 5 pillars, where do we see these athletes on the line? When they've started within ETP, that's more that brown line dot, and then the golden dot, how they're developing now, where we see they need to be to progress further within the performance pathway around NSWIS or OWIA level. And, we'll become better in time about plotting athletes on this line, but I think this gives a really nice visual representation, not only to coaches, but parents and athletes about where they're at, where they're improving, and where they need to be. I do want to touch on a little bit about case management for these targeted athletes. This is an area of my role which I will be involved in, looking and creating some closer surveillance to certain athletes within the ETP program, and it may include the following: a full sort of musculoskeletal screening to identify any risk factors within these athletes' profiles. There is the potential to be involved in coordinating or overseeing an athlete's medical services and rehabilitation, not necessarily completing that myself, but talking with external providers. It might be an athlete's local physio or liaising with their doctor to ensure that they're getting the appropriate care. And as with most of the athletes through the ETP system, we're working on highlighting target areas through this accurate profiling system, and then coordinating, those target pillars and provision of services if appropriate. And most importantly, working very closely with you guys, the coaches that are there on the ground. I want to really develop a strong relationship with all the club coaches, and it's great to see some really familiar names on this webinar so far, but a lot that I don't know, and really looking forward to getting to know you all and working with you to address any barriers to progression with these athletes and how we can facilitate their development. There may be the opportunity for these targeted ETP athletes to have some mentoring from senior or previous athletes within their discipline. That's an initiative that Ben and Beck and I are working away at in the background. And there may be some further development initiatives and opportunities in addition to the fundamental ETP activities, which will be further outlined in May with those letters of offer after we've examined all those nominations. And I guess where we see ETP going and from this new profiling pillars, I suppose, is we want to provide really easily digestible objective information to the athletes, to the parents, to the coaches on where this athlete is at in terms of their pathway progress, and also to national discipline committees and really have a good idea of where this athlete is within their journey. We want to really promote a strong culture to the athlete pathway programs, and no doubt all of the coaching programs and a lot of them are well on the way to that, but we really see that as a key fundamental approach to then being able to capitalise on this athlete profiling. As I touched on, I really want to work at supporting the coaches in the promotion of performance profiling culture within the disciplines. I think something like this, and there is a lot of evidence to back it up as well, and I'm happy to forward some references to anyone that is keen to view this a little bit further after this talk. But, you know, promoting this culture within the disciplines I think is key. And then from this data, we'll be able to get some nice interdisciplinary and intradisciplinary profiles. So moving forward, we'll be able to see, okay, 14 to 15-year-old athletes, what conditions do they come in at? How do they develop through? And which disciplines are coming through in reasonable condition, and which probably could do with a little bit more targeted work. So that's more of a longitudinal measure that we'll look at down the track. And the overarching, I suppose, goal from this is that we provide the athletes with the best chance possible to progress further through the performance pathway. And one of Ben's comments initially when I was taken into this role was that if we can increase the pool of this developing talent and then case manage them through and end up with a greater pool of athletes within these programs, then will hopefully lead to greater success on the world stage for these athletes down the track. And I guess in summary, some key messages here, you know, if we implement this appropriately across all the disciplines and we really take it on board and promote this culture, it does have the potential to drastically benefit the athlete's development and assist in some targeted utilisation of resources. You know, we want more physically capable athletes coming through. They have greater capacity to be available to train, resist injury, and become better athletes within their discipline. And promoting that culture again. And one of my other favourite quotes is, you know, ask not what is inside your head, but what is your head inside of. And if all of our heads are inside these really, I suppose, streamlined, fun, enjoyable, engaging programs that promote success but promote development of the athlete, not just on snow but as a person, I think we're going to see so much greater development moving forward. And I acknowledge that a lot of your club programs are well on the way, if not doing a fantastic job on that front. And just realising where we pitch our information to these athletes. All this information can be fantastic, but we don't want to overwhelm the athlete, and we really need to realise where each athlete is in their journey and pitch that information appropriately to them and to their parents as well. And that pretty much wraps up everything I was going to talk about today. Ben, did we want to open up to a bit of Q&A from anyone?
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we do, Ben, thanks very much for that. And I'm sure everyone will agree on this call. You know, very informative and certainly a different approach that we're taking to the emerging talent program. There's been a lot of work put in from Ben himself in this space to really understand, I guess, what the vision was of putting him in this role, and I think from my side, you certainly captured that very well today, and that was certainly the vision that we all had when we, you know, put you in this role, and how we see the development of athletes moving through the performance pathway. So excellent information, and yeah, I would open it up to the floor for any questions, obviously to myself or Ben or Beck, and yeah, happy to answer anything from the group at the moment.
Just to start off, I just got a message from Graham Cox. He just asked if we could touch on the role of parents and self-responsibility in a webinar tomorrow. So I think that will definitely be on the agenda tomorrow, Graham. So no problem. And the next question I've got on the chat is from Hamish. He said, how many people can a program nominate? And will Snow Australia contact athletes who are not selected into the program to inform them that they weren't selected? Does anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Hamish. Well, I guess there's no cap on the number of nominations. Obviously, Ben Bond outlined it in his information that we want coaches to be really honest with their nominations and make sure they understand all the pieces that we're looking for. And I think that'll guide the amount of nominations that you actually give to us. So, yes, we haven't capped it. So that's really back on the coaches and the clubs to understand their athletes and really come with the data. And in terms of supplying, the information in terms of selection, whether you've been selected or you haven't, yes, that will certainly come from us.
That's all the ones that have come through at the moment. Please feel free to not type. You can easily just turn off your mic and speak.
No questions is a sign that we must have
hang on.
Information in there.
Yeah, it's Graham here. I was just hoping you might touch on my question a little bit now in anticipation of questions that we might get from parents, but not just that, but also from a coaching group perspective, we know about our role and what our expectations of commitment and role from parents and athletes should be, because we're dealing with young people who need guidance and direction. So that, to me, when my kids were growing up and becoming athletes, this was a critical part of their development, and I think it's worthwhile that the coaches have an understanding of what that role should be, not just from a parent perspective, but from the coach's perspective as well.
Ben?
Yeah, no, thanks, Graham. It's a good point. And can I just clarify? Are you talking more about the parents' role in the support of that developing athlete moving forward, and their role to kind of, I suppose, relay and support the messages of the club coaches moving forward? Is that more what you're talking about there, Graham?
Yes, but also about if we're talking about emerging talent program, for example, to foster that, the responsibility for involvement in that, or dependence directly on the coaches or the clubs for that part of it, is not going to be successful unless there's that commitment and that involvement from the parents to be committed to the program, and what should that involvement and how should that look? We're talking about an emerging talent program that who's going to provide that, and what support should there be at the grassroots level from the actual athletes' parents, because the athletes are still developing all of the knowledge and skills to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great point, and I guess a lot of it is going to be reliant on individual factors within each family and each family's dynamics, and the degree of support that family or parent couple are able to provide to their child, how involved in snow sport they have been in the past, what their current involvement is, and what their understanding of where their child is at within their pathway. So I guess a lot of that education on a parent front is ideally comes from the club coaches and the club programs about what the baseline level of expectation is from the club program on the parents and on the athletes, and whether the parents can accommodate and facilitate and support that. And then what the emerging talent program does on top of that is, you know, provides a little bit more surveillance of that athlete moving forward. There will be, you know, external workshops and, you know, potentially a couple of camp type activities that are additional on top of what the club programs are. But I guess each family is different and individual, and it's up, you know, the club coaches and club programs having an idea of where each athlete is at, and then what capability their family has to support that, and educating that down to a parent level. Does that sort of answer your question?
It does partly, Ben, but the other part of it is there is already a perception amongst parents that, all right, their child is going to be nominated, for example, to an ETP program, and the parents or some parents have the attitude, well, that program will take care of it, and I just don't have to do anything.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in, Graham and Ben? And yeah, Graham, I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. And probably where we're heading from today, and this is something that we haven't done in the past, is the education piece. And this is a really important piece. This is actually the most important piece, that we run these sessions and we try and educate as much as we can to the coaches, the clubs and the pathway programs, but also additionally, tomorrow we obviously have the same session with the parents and athletes. I envisage running these sessions at multiple times throughout the domestic winter, whether they're in person or through a webinar-based system. But I think it's much about us being, you know, Snow Australia and the Emerging Talent Program, trying to educate the parents and the athletes and the coaches and everyone along the way. So everyone is along for that journey. And I think that's been a misconception in the past, where we haven't had a lot of information about emerging talent. So, you know, the perspective from a parent that their child should have an emerging talent scholarship or be a part of the program, that was an uneducated view of that, because they probably didn't understand what the program was actually about. So I think that's the piece that we're trying to collectively fix. And certainly that's going to take quite some time, I think. But I think it starts today, where we can actually have these questions and answers and talk about the program in readiness for really, you know, guiding parents and athletes through the program. And I think secondly, it's about the clubs, you know, and the programs, because the Emerging Talent Program isn't a standalone program. It's actually supporting athletes that already sit within a club, that already have a coach, and we try and break down some of those barriers that they might have in their progression. So yeah, I think it's a big education piece for us at the moment, and certainly certainly something that we're willing to tackle with all the parents, all the athletes, and all the clubs.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ben.
Sorry, you were on mute, Beck.
Sorry, just to finish up that, we did run a lot of webinars in 2020 because we couldn't have that face-to-face contact. So there were parents invited into actually listening into all of those webinars to get that educational piece. And we did actually host one or two parent-specific webinars as well around that emerging talent. So that will, as Ben mentioned, will continue Cree wants to ask a question, so I'll pass over to you, Cree.
Hey, Bondi. Hey, Ben. Just a quick one. I'm still a little bit confused on who it's for and what ages. And sorry to make it discipline specific, but like the Alpine, if we're looking at T1 to Tier 3, we don't really have many who are in that space. And for the ones who I would probably select, I'm looking at 10 to 12-year-olds whose only competition have been inter-school events. So that's a pretty hard one to gauge on. And so I just wasn't sure who for Alpine I should be targeting.
Ben, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, maybe if you start, Ben, then I can follow up.
Nice. It's a really good question, Cree, and this is really something that we're going to have to work with the clubs on because each of the disciplines have different age groups, and as Ben said in his opening, it's not age specific, but we are looking at that T1 to T3. We are looking for athletes that are trending towards performance pathway, institute scholarships, NSWIS, OWIA. The two disciplines which fall outside of that a little bit, unfortunately, are alpine and cross country. So we certainly don't want to exclude those disciplines, and we have no intention of excluding those disciplines. But I think when we get to the discussion with the coaches and yourself, Cree, around who do you target and who do you identify, I think that's going to be a little bit of a different discussion than what we might have with, say, moguls and park and pipe and snowball cross. We're going to have to, I'll use the word case manage that a little bit, but we're really going to have to understand the discipline and the athletes which sit within it. And we might have a little bit of a different matrix of selection with those disciplines that don't traditionally have, an athlete at the M1 level or that really high level like the other disciplines have. So I think we're going to have to work with you on a case-by-case basis, and we're going to have to really understand who those athletes are and how they're tracking within the pathway. And listen, you might have less athletes than the other disciplines. That just might be the nature of it. But still, with that, it's not to say that we're not going to select athletes into emerging talent. Hope I answered it.
All right, cheers.
Ben, do you want to expand on that at all, or did I cover it?
Yeah, no, I think it was quite comprehensive. I think as Ben highlighted, Cree, it is a tricky one with cross country and alpine falling outside that, that structured NSWIS OWIA pathway. But I think it's been highlighted, if we can triage those ones that you do see tracking through to national team selection along what the designated alpine pathway is, there may be some slightly different age groups to what the typical ETP tiering is around, but I think it's more of a individual discussion to be had, and as Ben highlighted, more of a case-by-case proposition about working through that, and it probably will look a little bit different to the other disciplines, but it's just a matter of working through that.
Cool, cheers, Bondi.
You were just on mute, Beck.
Sorry, I keep muting myself. Bud, did you want to go next? And then Jackson's also his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Beck. Sorry, it was just pretty much similar to it was almost about to answer Christian's question there that Ben sort of jumped in on, and I think it's been on my mind as well. And after having this discussion today and doing a little research prior to this, I mean, as you said, there's different sports that have different age groups that tend to either develop earlier or have different pathways through the sport. And I think for alpine is when I really look at it and I'm honest with myself and the sport of alpine, then there will be very few alpine athletes, I think, in that T1 to T3 range, knowing myself what that T1 to T3 range actually means in the realistic world of ski racing is a lot of the clubs and athletes within clubs at a young age are really still in the F3 stage. So it is going to be difficult. We've got some very focused parents, I would say, that maybe are not realistic. So then that goes back to touching on what you mentioned before about the education piece towards the parents to make them understand the realistic side of where they sit. So yeah, it was good to just go through this and really understand more of, because we've already had, I think Christian has already had a few, and I've definitely had a few very focused parents with 12-year-olds who think they might be on an ETP scholarship, but I think the important part is hopefully they get some education tomorrow on that.
Yeah, and really good comments, Bud. Certainly, I think tomorrow there's going to be a lot of questions with Alpine for sure. But I think it's good because we're at the start of the education piece, and I think hopefully the work that we do from an education standpoint actually assists you with the club and having the parents understand maybe where the athletes are actually within the clubs. We certainly want to do that. That's part of our role in the pathway. And like we said before, I think we just have to look at it a little bit differently. I think with Alpine and cross country, and maybe it's more framed around how you're trending or tracking towards the national team, as opposed to how you're tracking towards an OWA scholarship or an NSWIS scholarship. So there might be some levers within that we can pull on. But yeah, I think that the education piece with the parents is going to be fundamentally where it's going to sit, and hopefully they're interested in understanding what it is and how the profiling of athletes actually works. So
yeah, true. No, it is very different, and looking at maybe knowing what qualification criteria is for the likes of NSWIS and national team. In Alpine there'd be athletes on the national team currently who might be in T1, T2, and not even at T3 yet, which wouldn't even meet ETP right now. So yeah, there might be a little bit of, as you say, a bit more specific based on the sport and the Alpine and cross country, obviously. So yeah, no, I agree with that.
Great. And then Jackson, I'll hand over to you now if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question that I've had a fair bit sort of over the last week, and I think you guys will get tomorrow. We're going to have a lot of athletes that are in the situation of potentially missing the 2020 season, not being on snow over about a year, and not working with their particular coach or working with a different coach in 2020. So who do you guys suggest handles their nomination? Who would you like to see provide this data? And if there are athletes with coaches that are no longer coaching, that they don't have contact with, who can then handle their nominations?
It's a good question, Jackson, and certainly one that we've thought of. We understand that the activity last winter was limited with COVID, that some programs didn't operate, especially here in Australia, and then certainly overseas, pretty much nothing operated aside from the senior athletes and their programs. But we understand that, and I guess the easy answer would be that whoever was their last coach, if that coach is still in the system, then that coach should potentially nominate that athlete. But if an athlete is stuck between no coaches, then I would urge that athlete to get in contact with either myself or Beck or Ben, and we can review that nomination on a case-by-case basis. We certainly don't want to just count them out because they haven't been nominated by a coach, but we think that those numbers are going to be quite low, so we can manage that on a case-by-case basis for sure. So if you are speaking to athletes, then if they fall into that situation, then I would recommend that they get in contact with us and we can manage their nomination.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's all that has their hand up. So I'm not sure if there's anyone else.
If there's no further questions.
Oh, hang on. Greg just put up his hand. So I'll pass it over to Greg.
Hey, sorry, I'm still a bit confused with the age group question that Cree asked. Like, I'm Park and Pipe, but yeah, like, can we nominate like is there age group specific we want to nominate? I'm a bit confused, still confused.
No, there's no age group specific, and I think Greg, specifically, if you're Park and Pipe, then I would think that the majority of emerging talent athletes for Park and Pipe will be in that 12, 13, 14, 15 years of age, and up. It's a younger discipline, and to get into the sport and the progressions that we've seen worldwide to reach not only scholarship level but high levels on the world stage. That is a trending younger discipline. So with Park and Pipe, for sure, there's no limit on the nomination age, and I would think that they would be in that age bracket.
Okay. No, all good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's everyone that's got their hands up. If there's no more.
Well, if there's no further questions, everyone, thank you very much. Thank you for the time to present to you this afternoon. As we've said, we're excited about the new process. We're certainly engaged in the information piece and the communication of what the Emerging Talent Program is. And I would urge all of you, if you want to do another session with your club or your coaches within your club or your parents of athletes within that, then I would urge you to get in contact with us, and we can tailor those sessions directly to your club as we get closer to the season. So I'm happy to run as many of these as we need to with yourselves and the community. And thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Beck.
Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.